My name's Jim Mallinson. I'm the University Professor of Sanskrit. I'm also Professorial Fellow here at Balliol. I teach at AMES, which is the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I teach Indian history, religion and culture, and Sanskrit language, of course, and research methods for Indology, so the study of classical India. My main research focus is on the history of yoga and its practitioners. I've spent many years living in India with traditional practitioners of yoga. And so the kind of core of my research work is editing Sanskrit texts from manuscripts, old texts on yoga, trying to reconstruct the history of the traditional practice through that, but also through using insights from the time I've spent with practitioners in India. And I look quite a lot at the art historical record as well. At the Faculty of AMES, we really put a lot of importance on the study of language. Of course, that's the core of all our degree subjects. So really an aptitude for learning languages is pretty key. It's a good idea to read up on the position of that language in the culture of which it's a part, to understand a certain amount about the language. In terms of when you're applying, we don't expect you to have a working knowledge of that language, but it's certainly helpful if you have studied other languages, because the courses are very intensive at the outset with the language acquisition. So if you haven't had training in language learning before, you're going to find it quite difficult. If you do get accepted, it's a good idea to make a start on the language as well before you get here. We'll send out materials, suggestions for what you might want to read and start working on. Most of the languages that we teach at AMES have a separate script, a new script, not the same as the Roman alphabet used for English. So it's a good idea to make solid steps at acquiring that, picking that up before you start. Otherwise you'll be scrambled trying to learn grammar and script at the same time in the first few weeks. In the tutorial system here, I normally give 4 tutorials a year, and they're on topics to do with Indian history when I'm teaching undergraduates. So we give a core reading list beforehand, and then there's a broader reading list as well, so you can go deeper into certain aspects of each topic if that's what you want to do. We encourage that, of course. And then students will email me their essays before the tutorial. It's not like the old system where you used to come in and read it out and the professor would sit there sort of perhaps harumphing or cheering or whatever. Now you send it to me beforehand, I will read them before the tutorial. There will be maybe 1, 2 or 3 students in the tutorial, and I'll encourage dialogue between the students as well. Sometimes they will have answered slightly different questions on a similar theme, so that helps to develop conversation in that one student can present their ideas to the other student, and I will facilitate that dialogue. Tutorials are structured in a fairly free-form way. It depends on the subject, depends on the student. I like to encourage dialogue between students. Often, I have 1, 2 or 3 students. I like 2, I think, is best, but sometimes 3 works very well too. And so I like maybe the students to be answering slightly different questions about the same topic, which means they can then speak to each other, inform one another, and I can facilitate that dialogue as it goes along. In the tutorials, I will have read the essays beforehand. Students email them to me beforehand. So the essays in themselves will raise questions that I will want to discuss. Perhaps I feel that an idea hasn't been fully developed, or there's a rather brilliant idea that hadn't occurred to me before, and I will ask one student to explain that to the other one, or explain it to me if I haven't fully understood what they've written. And that way I like to, and I'll have a whole list of questions normally has arisen out of reading each essay. So I like to promote a dialogue between the students as the tutorial progresses. Each degree at AMES is really focuses on developing language skills. It's pretty intense, particularly, speaking from the point of view of Sanskrit, my subject. The first year, you're having 3 Sanskrit classes a week. And by the end of it, you can read major texts, important texts of Sanskrit history, the Bhagavad Gita or bits of the Mahabharata, the famous Indian epic. At the same time, you're also having minimum of 2 lectures a week, but there's lots of other things going on. And one of the problems, which is not really a problem of Oxford, is that there are so many exciting, interesting lectures going on all the time. But you're expected to go to 2 sort of core lectures each week on the Tuesday and the Thursday, and your essays, you'll be doing an essay every fortnight, and they will be based on the lecture content. Speaking about the Sanskrit undergraduate degree in particular, it's well structured, but there's plenty of scope for tailoring things to particular interests, and also you get to do a dissertation in the 3rd year if you want to, where you can go really deep into a subject that particularly interests you. And we have some flexibility. It's normally a pretty small cohort. Beginners Sanskrit, there might be 15 or so, but they're doing differently. They might be doing doctoral studies, there might be master students all mixed in. But then when you set off for the remainder of the undergraduate degree, there's quite a degree of amount of flexibility that we can put in that we can see that what students are interested in. We can read particular kinds of poetry that they might fancy reading, and we can steer you towards dissertations that might reflect your interests as well. The tutorials I've had with my students, I've only been in Oxford for a year, but they have actually been the highlight of my teaching so far. Sometimes it's rather daunting because I'm having to teach tutorials perhaps on subjects that I'm not an expert on. I'm teaching tutorials on the entire 5,000 years of Indian history. And I particularly remember one tutorial where I had students who were also classicists. So at AMES you can combine subjects. You can do classics with Asian and Middle Eastern studies, or you can do religious studies with Asian and Middle Eastern studies. We call those CAMES and RAMES. And I had a great trio of students who we were looking at the 3rd century BCE inscriptions of Ashoka, which is a fascinating subject, but really not a specialist area of mine. I worked 2,000 years later on. But they were classicists, and they had looked at the inscriptions are multilingual, and they have Greek translations as well, and they'd looked at the variations between the different inscriptions in the Greek translations. So I actually sat there and just learnt from them as they put forward theories about how the text for these inscriptions might have been transmitted in the 3rd century BCE. So I learn things from my students during the tutorials as well, which is wonderful. I particularly enjoy lecturing on subjects that I already feel that I'm an expert in because of the quality of the feedback and the questions I get from the students. So in fact, this year I'm doing a series of lectures on the history of yoga, which is not really part of any particular course, but it's probably the best attended lecture series I'm giving because people turn up and they find it interesting and entertaining, I hope, to some extent. But the questions I get at the end of those lectures, or sometimes during the lectures, and then often I'm asked questions that had not occurred to me, and people see either problems in what I'm presenting, or they look at it in a different way, and they ask questions which will often then go on to inform my own research in the future, which is great. Teaching at Balliol is great. I mean, I don't actually teach that much at Balliol myself because I'm a university appointment and most of my teaching is done in the faculty, but I do lecture here. My History of Yoga series is done in the wonderful new Gillis Lecture Theatre here at Balliol. But teaching at Balliol, teaching at the university full stop, is wonderful for the quality of the students. I mean, the students are normally extremely talented and very inquisitive, and they come at me with questions that I'd never expect. And then seeing them develop, seeing them broaden their interests, seeing also the extracurricular opportunities are fantastic. In Sanskrit, for example, we put on a Sanskrit play. I mean, and that's a lot of fun, and it's not part of the course at all, but it sort of brings everyone together. And I wasn't involved last year. I watched it last year, very impressive. So I've signed up this year for a cameo role. I'm looking forward to that, but looking forward to seeing how the students put it on, because last year it was extremely impressive. In fact, this week I'm going to a production of Euripides' Orestes put on by one of the AMES students, a classicist who's also doing Sanskrit. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, finding out about the various extracurricular things that the students do is great. There's so much opportunity here at Oxford for doing all kinds of interesting things.